A Mossad agent named only M was killed in 2023, and in April 2026, Israel confirmed he helped lay the groundwork for a war that officially began on February 28, 2026. That is the central structural fact. Not the war itself, not the timing of the strikes. The fact that the preparation for war was already operational 3 years before the first bomb fell. Before I go further, I want to know where you are watching this from and what your structural reading of this is. Put it in the comments, and stay until the end, because the data point in the final report changes how this entire report reads. Let me be precise about what was said. On April 22, 2026, during a formal ceremony, Mossad Director David Barnea publicly acknowledged that an agent known only as M had been killed outside Israel in 2023. He stated that this agent played what he described as a key role in laying the groundwork for the 2026 Iran war. He did not provide operational details. He did not specify location. He did not explain the nature of the missions, but he did define the strategic significance. Here is what the data actually shows. The war begins in 2026. The groundwork was active in 2023. That is a 3-year gap between covert preparation and overt conflict. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. During those same years, 2023, 2024, 2025, the official position from both Washington and Israel was consistent. Diplomacy was still the preferred path. Military action was described as a last resort. Public messaging emphasized negotiation, containment, and delay. So we have two parallel tracks. On one track, diplomatic engagement is presented as the primary approach. On the other, covert intelligence operations are actively preparing the conditions for war. Today's diplomacy often coexists with tomorrow's battlefield preparation. This is not unusual in statecraft, but the timing matters. The overlap matters, because it changes how we interpret intent. Most analysis of this misses one critical factor. The disclosure is not about the agent, it is about the timeline. When a state confirms that war planning was operational years before war began, it is telling you something about how decisions are actually made. Consider the structure here. Intelligence operations of this kind, described as combining creativity, cunning, and technology, do not begin spontaneously. They require authorization. They require resource allocation. They require strategic direction. That means that by 2023, there was already a defined pathway toward potential military conflict. Let me be very precise about this. This does not mean that war in 2026 was inevitable. It means that war in 2026 was being prepared for in a structured, sustained, and deliberate way. Preparation does not guarantee action, but it makes action possible at speed. And this is the part of the report that almost no one in Western media is explaining accurately. Public narratives often frame wars as reactions, triggered by immediate events, sudden escalations, or last-minute decisions. But the archival record, when it becomes available, consistently shows something else. Wars are usually the visible endpoint of processes that began years earlier, often under very different public narratives. We have seen this exact dynamic before. In multiple cases, across different regions, governments maintain diplomatic engagement while simultaneously building the operational capacity for conflict. Not because they are deceptive in a simple sense, but because they are managing uncertainty. They are keeping options open. States rarely choose between diplomacy and war. They prepare for both. Now think carefully about what that means in this case. If groundwork for the 2026 war was already underway in 2023, then every diplomatic signal between those years must be reinterpreted in that context. Not dismissed, not invalidated, but understood as part of a dual-track strategy. And this raises the central analytical question for this report. If war preparation was active while diplomacy was being publicly prioritized, what was the actual strategic logic guiding decision-making during those 3 years? Strategy is always clearer in the archive than in the moment. That is the question we now need to answer. The preparation for the 2026 Iran war began no later than 2023, and both Israel and the United States publicly maintained that diplomacy remained the preferred path during that same period. That is not a contradiction. It is a dual-structure strategy. To understand why this happened, you have to separate public signaling from operational planning. States operate on multiple timelines. The public timeline is designed for audiences, domestic, international, and adversarial. The operational timeline is designed for capability, what can actually be executed and when. Let me be very precise about this. From Israel's perspective, the logic is rooted in uncertainty management. When Mossad Director David Barnea described the operations led by Agent M as combining creativity, cunning, and technology, and said they significantly influenced the success of the campaign against Iran, he was pointing to a category of activity that exists before war, not during it. These are shaping operations. They do not begin when war starts. They begin when war is still a possibility. War is not decided at the moment it begins. It is shaped long before. Now consider the timing. In 2023, the official line remained that military action was a last resort. That suggests that, at least at the level of public policy, war was not yet the chosen path. But preparation was underway. This is not what most people think it is. Preparation at this level does not require a final decision to go to war. It requires a decision that war is a plausible outcome that must be prepared for. That is a different threshold. Planning for a possibility often looks identical to planning for a decision. And this is where the analysis must shift to Washington's position as well. The United States, during the same period, maintained that diplomacy was still viable. That messaging was consistent. But from a structural perspective, Washington also operates under the same logic: preserve optionality. Washington reads preparation as deterrence. Beijing, or in this case Tehran, reads it as intent. Both readings follow internal logic. Signals are interpreted through the fears of the receiver, not the intent of the sender. This is mode 3, both sides dissection. Israel prepares covertly to ensure that if conflict becomes necessary, it is not starting from zero. The United States maintains diplomatic posture to preserve international legitimacy and delay escalation. Iran, observing these signals, must interpret whether these preparations indicate an approaching inevitability or a precaution. And this is where miscalculation risk emerges. Miscalculation requires no malice, only two different definitions of acceptable risk. Now, there is a data point in this report that changes the structural picture entirely. 3 years. That is the gap between the confirmed operational groundwork and the start of the war. 3 years is not a short-term contingency window. It is not reactive planning. It is sustained preparation across multiple cycles of political, military, and intelligence coordination. Think carefully about what that means. It means that whatever operations Agent M was involved in were not isolated missions. They were part of a longer campaign design, a design that assumed time, that assumed continuity, that assumed escalation might eventually occur. Time is the clearest indicator of intent in strategy. And this is the part of the report that almost no one is explaining accurately. Because the presence of diplomacy during those years leads many observers to conclude that war was avoided until it suddenly became unavoidable. But the existence of sustained covert groundwork suggests something else, that war was one of several anticipated outcomes being actively prepared for. This does not mean that diplomacy was insincere. That would be an oversimplification. It means that diplomacy and preparation were happening simultaneously because decision makers did not assume a single outcome. Let me be very precise about this. States do not prepare for war because they want war. They prepare for war because they do not control all variables. Ignorance of uncertainty is not strategy. Preparation for it is. We have seen this exact dynamic before, in different regions, under different conditions, but with the same structural logic. Covert groundwork precedes overt conflict. Diplomatic engagement continues during preparation. Public narratives lag operational reality. And when the archive opens, as it partially has here, the timeline becomes visible. Now return to the statement made by Barnea. He did not reveal operational details, but he made a deliberate choice to reveal timing and significance. That is itself a signal. Washington calls this strategic communication. Others may read it as retrospective justification. Both interpretations are possible, but structurally what matters is this. The acknowledgement confirms that the pathway to war was not built in reaction to immediate events in 2026. It was constructed over years. Outcomes that appear sudden are usually the result of long preparation. So the question becomes more precise. If both diplomacy and war preparation were pursued in parallel, what does that tell us about how states actually manage high-risk relationships? That is what we now turn to. The confirmed timeline shows that preparation for the 2026 Iran war was underway by 2023, while diplomacy was publicly maintained as the preferred path during that same period. That is not an anomaly. That is the structure. Let me be very precise about this. When a state conducts sustained covert groundwork over a 3-year period, it is not reacting to a single trigger. It is managing a strategic environment in which multiple outcomes are considered plausible, and at least one of those outcomes, war, is being actively prepared for at an operational level. This is a structural problem, not a personality problem. States do not wait for certainty. They act under uncertainty. Now consider how this changes the interpretation of the events surrounding the start of the war on February 28, 2026. The visible beginning of the war is not the beginning of the process. It is the moment when one prepared pathway becomes activated. Everything that preceded it, including the operations attributed to Agent M, belongs to the phase where options are constructed, not yet chosen. By the time a war begins, the structure is already in place. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. There is a tendency to look backward from the outbreak of war and identify a single decisive moment, a failure of diplomacy, a provocation, a misstep. But the presence of long-term groundwork complicates that narrative. It suggests that the system was already configured in a way that made escalation possible at relatively short notice. Not inevitable, but readily executable. Inevitability is often assigned after the fact. Now step back further. From Israel's perspective, preparing for a potential conflict with Iran over multiple years reflects a calculation about risk, not a certainty of war, but an assessment that the cost of being unprepared would be unacceptable. From Washington's perspective, maintaining a diplomatic posture during the same period reflects a different but parallel calculation, that preserving negotiation space and international legitimacy remains essential, even while contingencies are being considered. From Iran's perspective, observing without access to the internal logic of these preparations, the coexistence of diplomacy and covert groundwork can be read as contradiction, or as confirmation that conflict is being structured in advance. Washington reads preparation as deterrence. Iran may read it as prelude. Both readings follow internal logic. Every signal has multiple audiences. Each hears something different. And this is the part of the report that almost no one is explaining accurately. Because the public narrative tends to separate diplomacy and war as distinct phases, first one, then the other. But the structural reality, as revealed by this timeline, is that they often coexist, not sequentially, but simultaneously. Let me be very precise about this. Diplomacy does not always prevent war. Sometimes it operates alongside preparation for war, because decision makers do not assume that diplomacy will succeed. That is not a failure of diplomacy, it is a reflection of uncertainty. Hope for resolution does not eliminate preparation for failure. Now consider the implication of the disclosure itself. By confirming that an agent who died in 2023 played a key role in laying the groundwork for a war that began in 2026, Israeli leadership has made the preparatory phase visible. Not in operational detail, but in strategic outline. That visibility changes how the timeline is understood. It shifts the focus away from immediate triggers and toward long-term structuring. It suggests that what appears as a sudden escalation is often the result of extended, layered preparation that remains hidden until after the fact. Visibility comes late, structure comes early. This was not inevitable. It became likely through a series of specific decisions. Decisions to prepare, to maintain options, to operate on parallel tracks of diplomacy and contingency planning. And once those structures are in place, the threshold for moving from preparation to execution can become lower than it appears from the outside. Think carefully about what that means. It means that the most important phase of a conflict is often the one that is least visible. The years when groundwork is being laid, when capabilities are being built, when strategic pathways are being quietly constructed. By the time the conflict becomes visible, the range of possible outcomes has already narrowed. Structural forces do not require bad intentions to produce bad outcomes. So the conclusion is not about the individual agent, and it is not about a single decision in 2026. The conclusion is about the structure revealed by the timeline. War preparation and diplomacy were not alternatives. They were concurrent strategies operating within the same system of uncertainty. And in that system, the path to conflict is not created in a moment. It is built over time. Script process complete.